In 2006, Columbus police were called to investigate a missing person report that seemed routine at first. A 27-year-old medical student who hadn't returned home after a night out with friends. But when investigators reviewed the security footage from the bar where Brian Shaffer was last seen, they didn't find what they expected. Instead, they found something impossible. The cameras showed Brian entering the bar. They showed him talking to friends, having drinks, socializing. They even captured him at 1:55 a.m., standing just outside the entrance, chatting briefly with two women before stepping out of frame. But they never showed him leaving. Not through the main entrance. Not through any other recorded exit. Not in disguise. Not with his head down. Not at any point during the rest of the night. A second-year medical student had walked into a bar on the second floor of a building covered by security cameras and had simply ceased to exist. But what investigators learned as they dug deeper into that night was far stranger than a simple missing person case. The person at the center of this story was Brian Randall Shaffer, a 27-year-old medical student who lived in Columbus, Ohio, just blocks from the Ohio State University campus where he studied. People who knew Brian described him as friendly, ambitious, and well-liked, the kind of person who seemed destined for success. He had graduated from Ohio State with a degree in microbiology 6 years earlier and was now in his second year at the OSU College of Medicine. His friends saw him as someone who had his life together, someone who knew where he was going. But there was one thing about Brian that almost no one fully realized in those early months of 2006. He was carrying a weight that he rarely showed to others. Just weeks before his disappearance in March 2006, Brian's mother Renee had died of myelodysplasia, a rare blood disorder. While Brian appeared to his friends to be handling the loss well, those closest to him knew that her death had shaken him deeply. He was dealing with grief in the way many young people do, by pushing forward, by staying busy, by not letting anyone see how much it hurt. But grief has a way of manifesting when you least expect it. Meanwhile, Brian was dealing with the ordinary pressures of medical school. The endless studying, the critical exams, the exhaustion that comes with pursuing one of the most demanding careers imaginable. On March 31st, 2006, a Friday, classes at Ohio State ended for spring break. It was a moment every student looked forward to. A week of freedom, a chance to breathe after months of relentless work. Brian celebrated that evening the way many students do. He had dinner with his father, Randy. A steak dinner, something special to mark the occasion. Randy noticed that his son looked exhausted. Brian had pulled an all-nighter earlier in the week, cramming for upcoming exams, and the fatigue showed. Randy privately thought that Brian shouldn't go out that night, that he should rest instead, but he didn't say anything. Brian was an adult, after all, and he had plans. At 9 p.m., Brian met his friend, William Clint Florence, at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona located in the South Campus Gateway complex on High Street. It was a popular spot, crowded and loud, the kind of place where students went to unwind. An hour later, Brian called his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, who had already left Columbus to visit her family in Toledo. The two had plans, big plans. They were scheduled to fly to Miami together in just a few days for a spring break trip. Alexis and their friends believed that Brian might propose to her on that trip. He had hinted at wanting to start a life that balanced his medical career with his real passion, music. He loved Jimmy Buffett's laid-back tropical sound and dreamed of starting a band someday. After the call, Brian and Clint left the Ugly Tuna Saloona and went bar hopping, visiting several establishments as they made their way down toward the Arena District. At each stop, according to Clint, they had one shot of hard liquor. Nothing excessive, just the casual drinking of two friends celebrating the start of a break. After midnight, they met up with Meredith Reed, a friend of Clint's, in the Short North neighborhood. Reed gave them a ride back to where they had started, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They went back inside for one last round. And it was during those final moments inside that bar that Brian Shaffer made a decision that no one can fully explain. He separated from his friends, not knowing this would be the last choice that anyone would ever witness him make. When Brian's friends realized he was no longer with them inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona, they did what anyone would do. They tried to find him. Clint Florence and Meredith Reed called his phone repeatedly. No answer. They searched the bar, moving through the crowded space, checking the bathrooms, asking other patrons if they had seen him. Nothing. At 2 a.m., when the bar closed and patrons began filing out, Clint and Meredith waited outside. They watched the crowd disperse, looking for Brian among the departing faces. He never emerged. Eventually, they came to the most logical conclusion. Brian must have left earlier without telling them and gone home. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't alarming either. People lose track of friends in crowded bars all the time. Cell phones die. Plans change. They figured they would hear from him the next day. But the next day came and Brian didn't call. Alexis tried reaching him that weekend. His phone went straight to voicemail. She assumed he was sleeping off a hangover or had let his battery die. Spring break had just started. Maybe he was taking some time to relax. Randy Shaffer tried calling his son as well. No response. Monday morning arrived. The day Brian and Alexis were supposed to fly to Miami together. Brian never showed up at the airport. He didn't call. He didn't text. He simply wasn't there. That's when the calls to the police began. Something was very wrong. Columbus police began their investigation at the last place Brian had been seen, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The bar was located on the second floor of the Gateway building, a modern complex in an area that had historically struggled with crime. Because of this, the building's owners had installed security cameras throughout the premises. If Brian had left the bar, the cameras would have caught it. Investigators requested the footage. What they found was deeply unsettling. The cameras showed Brian, Clint, and Meredith arriving back at the bar around 1:15 a.m., riding the escalator up to the main entrance. The footage showed them entering the establishment, joining the crowd inside. At 1:55 a.m., the camera outside the bar's entrance captured Brian standing in the doorway. He was talking briefly to two young women, just a casual conversation, the kind that happens 100 times a night in any bar. He said goodbye, smiled, and then moved out of the camera's frame. And then, nothing. The bar closed at 2 a.m. The cameras captured every person who left through the main entrance. Students, couples, groups of friends, everyone filed past the escalator, captured clearly by the security system. Brian Shaffer was not among them. Investigators watched the footage again and again. They studied every frame, looking for any sign of Brian leaving the building. They checked to see if he might have disguised himself somehow, put on a hat, changed his jacket, kept his head down to avoid the cameras. Nothing. He simply wasn't there. For a moment, investigators considered the possibility that Brian was still inside the building, that he had passed out somewhere or had an accident or was somehow still on the premises. But searches of the bar turned up nothing. Brian Shaffer had entered the Ugly Tuna Saloona shortly after 1 a.m., and then he had vanished. Every path leading back out, at least every path that was recorded, showed no trace of him. And that's when the investigation truly shifted from a missing person case to something far more mysterious. Investigators would soon learn that the Ugly Tuna Saloona's security coverage, while extensive, was not perfect. The truth was far more complicated than a simple case of camera malfunction. While the main entrance was thoroughly monitored, there was a service exit near where Brian was last seen on camera. This exit was not meant for public use. It was a back way used by staff and deliveries. The door led to a hallway on the first floor, which at that time connected to a construction area. That construction zone had its own exit to the outside. In theory, Brian could have left through this route. But there were problems with this theory. The path would have been difficult to navigate, especially for someone who had been drinking. The hallway was dimly lit, the construction area was cluttered with materials and debris, and the route would have required Brian to make several turns and navigate obstacles, all while intoxicated. Some officers who examined the route believed it would have been nearly impossible for a drunk person to successfully navigate without stumbling, making noise, or drawing attention. But there was something else that investigators discovered, something that made the mystery even deeper. The cameras in that area were not foolproof. One camera panned back and forth across the space constantly, creating gaps in coverage. The other was manually operated, meaning it only recorded when someone was actively controlling it. If Brian had left through the service exit during one of those gaps, he could have slipped through undetected. But if that was the case, why would he have chosen that route? Why would a medical student, slightly intoxicated, navigate a dark construction zone instead of simply walking out the front door with everyone else? And unbelievably, no one could answer that question. But there was something else nobody knew, something that would haunt investigators for years. When Brian didn't return home and missed his flight to Miami, Alexis Wagoner and Randy Shaffer reported him missing to the Columbus police. Police immediately began canvassing the area around South Campus Gateway. They searched streets, alleyways, and parking lots. They checked dumpsters and waste containers. They brought in police dogs to track any scent. Officers knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen Brian or noticed anything unusual that night. Flyers were posted across Columbus. They showed Brian's photograph and included identifying details: a distinctive tattoo on his upper right arm, a stick figure from the cover of Pearl Jam's Alive single, one of his favorite bands, and a unique fleck in one of his irises. The flyers asked anyone with information to contact the police immediately. The search expanded. Police persuaded the city to allow them access to the sewer system beneath the Gateway building. Officers descended into the dark tunnels, searching for any sign of Brian. They found nothing. At Brian's apartment on King Avenue, just 6 blocks from the Ugly Tuna Saloona, his car sat parked outside. Inside the apartment, everything appeared normal. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Brian had returned home and packed to leave. His belongings were undisturbed. It was as if he had simply planned to return later that night and never made it. When investigators reviewed footage from 3 other nearby bars, hoping to catch Brian on camera somewhere else, they found nothing. No trace of him appeared on any surveillance system beyond that final frame at 1:55 a.m. Police began interviewing everyone who had seen Brian that night. His father, Randy, was asked to take a polygraph test. He passed. Meredith Reed took one as well and passed without issue. Others who had been present that night were also tested, and all passed. Clint Florence, Brian's friend who had been with him throughout the evening, declined to take a polygraph test on the advice of his attorney, Neil Rosenberg. Rosenberg maintained that Florence had cooperated fully from the beginning and had shared everything he knew about that night. Many attorneys advise their clients against taking polygraph tests regardless of guilt or innocence, as the tests are not always reliable and the results aren't admissible in court. Still, one detail didn't make sense, and it bothered investigators, the Shaffer family, and Alexis for years. Why would Brian Shaffer, a medical student days away from a romantic vacation with his girlfriend, simply disappear? Years later, when detectives reviewed the case files, they developed several theories about what might have happened to Brian Shaffer. They refused to discuss these theories in detail publicly, but piecing together the evidence reveals 2 primary possibilities that investigators focused on most heavily. Theory 1: the voluntary disappearance. Some investigators came to believe that Brian might have chosen to disappear. His mother had just died weeks earlier, a loss that, according to those close to him, affected him more deeply than he let on. He was under tremendous pressure in medical school, facing critical exams and the weight of expectations. Perhaps he simply couldn't handle it anymore. Perhaps the grief became too much, and he saw an escape route that no one else could understand. In this scenario, Brian walked out through the service exit deliberately, avoiding cameras. He knew about the construction area. He was a smart, observant person who could have noticed the alternative route during earlier visits to the bar. He timed his exit during a camera gap, navigated the dimly lit hallway and construction zone, and simply left. Started over somewhere new, under a different name, free from the pressures that had been suffocating him. This theory gained some traction in September 2006, 6 months after Brian disappeared. Alexis called his cell phone as she did every night. Usually it went straight to voicemail, but that night it rang 3 times before going to voicemail. I kept calling it to hear it purely because it was one of the best sounds I have ever heard, even if no one picked up, Alexis wrote on her MySpace page. Singular, Brian's wireless provider, suggested it might have been a computer glitch. But investigators discovered something else. A cell tower in Hilliard, 14 miles northwest of Columbus, had pinged Brian's phone around that time. Was Brian alive and carrying his phone? Was he out there somewhere, listening to it ring, unable or unwilling to answer? When Randy Shaffer died in 2008, struck by a falling tree branch during a storm, Someone posted a message in his online condolence book. To Dad, love Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands. The message suggested Brian was alive and living in the Caribbean, perhaps pursuing that dream of a relaxed, tropical lifestyle he'd always talked about. But investigators traced the post to a public computer in Franklin County, Ohio. It was determined to be a cruel hoax. Still, the theory persisted among some. Brian's attorney at the time later wrote that he had been led to believe by police that Brian was alive. Derek Shaffer, Brian's younger brother, says that he believes it's possible his brother chose to leave. If Brian did take off somewhere, if that is the case, Derek said, suggesting that perhaps Brian confided in someone before he left. But this theory has a fundamental problem. It requires believing that Brian Shaffer, a man days away from a romantic vacation where he planned to propose to his girlfriend, a dedicated medical student with years of hard work invested in his career, a son who had just lost his mother and surely understood how devastating another loss would be to his father, would abandon everyone who loved him without a word, without a sign, without even a hint that he was struggling enough to consider such a drastic step. Alexis Wagner never believed it. I can't imagine he would have just done that, she said years later. Theory 2. Foul play. Other investigators believed something far darker had happened that night. In this scenario, Brian encountered someone with violent intent. Perhaps in the bar, perhaps in the construction area near the service exit, perhaps just outside the building in the early morning hours. Perhaps it was random, a crime of opportunity. Perhaps it was someone Brian knew, though investigators found no evidence of conflicts or enemies in his life. The service exit theory takes on a different meaning here. If Brian did leave through that route, navigating the dark hallway and construction zone, he would have been vulnerable. Alone, slightly intoxicated, in an area with no cameras and no witnesses. Someone could have been waiting. Someone could have followed. Something could have happened in those unseen spaces that no security system ever captured. The area around South Campus Gateway had a history of crime. It wasn't unusual for people to be assaulted or robbed in the neighborhood, especially late at night. Perhaps Brian became a victim of circumstance. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person. This theory would explain why Brian never contacted anyone after that night, why his phone went dark, why no credible sightings were ever confirmed despite nationwide attention to his case. But it struggles to answer one critical question. What happened to his body? Randy Shaffer, desperate for answers, consulted a psychic who told him Brian's body was in the water near a bridge pier. Randy and Derek bought waders and spent months searching along the Olentangy River, which flows through Columbus near the OSU campus. Police searched the sewers beneath the Gateway building. Search dogs combed the streets and alleys. Volunteers checked dumpsters and vacant buildings. They found nothing. For this theory to be true, someone would have had to harm Brian and dispose of his body so thoroughly that one of the most extensive searches in Columbus history never found a trace. Not a piece of clothing. Not a single piece of physical evidence. Nothing. It's possible, but it requires almost perfect execution by someone who either got incredibly lucky or knew exactly what they were doing. Other possibilities investigators also considered whether Brian might have had an accident, perhaps becoming disoriented after drinking, wandering into a dangerous area, falling, or suffering a medical emergency. Some even briefly examined the controversial smiley face killer theory before dismissing it, as most law enforcement agencies have done. But none of these alternative theories adequately explained how Brian could vanish so completely from such a heavily monitored area. One of the original investigators, Andre Edwards, told Columbus Monthly magazine that after reviewing all the camera footage extensively, he could say with 100% certainty that Brian did not leave via the escalator or main entrance. But certainty about what didn't happen doesn't explain what did. In March 2021, nearly 15 years after Brian's disappearance, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released an age-progressed photo showing what Brian might look like at age 42. The image showed a middle-aged man with graying hair and the weight of years on his face. It was distributed across media outlets and shared online, generating renewed attention to the case. In 2019, a photograph had circulated online showing a homeless man in Tijuana, Mexico, who bore a resemblance to Brian. The image made its way to Columbus police, who forwarded it to the FBI for facial recognition analysis. The FBI ruled that the man was not Brian Shaffer. As of 2014, Columbus police were still receiving at least 2 tips per month about the case through the local Crime Stoppers hotline. None had proven useful. The evidence filled 4 boxes of files: witness statements, surveillance footage, search reports, and countless dead ends. Brian's loved ones remained divided on what they believed had happened. Alexis Wagoner came to believe that Brian was dead, that he hadn't simply run away. "I can't imagine he would have just done that," she said. Derek Shaffer held on to the possibility that his brother was still alive somewhere, perhaps having made a choice that no one else could understand. The questions remained, sharp and persistent. How did Brian Shaffer leave a building covered by security cameras without being recorded? If he left voluntarily, why did he abandon his girlfriend, his father, his brother, and his promising medical career? If he met with foul play, how did someone manage to harm him and dispose of his body without leaving any trace? And if something else happened, something no one has even thought to consider, what could it possibly have been? They found messages, witness statements, camera footage, and theories. They found grief and confusion and unanswered questions. But they never found Brian Shaffer. The case remains one of the strangest disappearances ever recorded in Ohio. A medical student, surrounded by friends and cameras, in a busy entertainment district on a Friday night, simply ceased to exist. No body, no credible sightings, no evidence of where he went or what happened to him. Before he died, Randy Shaffer worked with other families of missing adults in Ohio to pass legislation establishing statewide protocols for missing person investigations. The bill became law, a legacy built from loss, Randy's way of ensuring that other families might not suffer the same lack of answers that haunted him. But for the Shaffer family, for Alexis Wagoner, and for everyone who knew Brian, the questions remain. Somewhere, perhaps, Brian Shaffer is alive, living under a new name, carrying secrets no one can guess. Or somewhere, perhaps, his story ended that night in ways that investigators never uncovered. 2 possibilities, neither with proof. If you're interested in carefully researched cases like this one, you can subscribe to the channel. New investigations are released regularly. If you have thoughts about this case or details that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment below.